All right then. This is another edition of Kiron Talks on Thursdays as usual. And today we will again talk about open education, about digital skills, about the use of technology for education and related things. Again, we are together with Dominic Orr and Sabrina Konzok, or more precisely, Sabrina Konzok and Dominic Orr from Kiron. Sabrina is also involved in social entrepreneurship in Germany. And our special guest is Jehane Akiki from Lebanon, live with us now from New York. And she is, her previous work creating education programs for refugees led her to realize the need to reform certification for all and start learning blocks. So learning blocks is the thing that she started. And we want to learn more about that and about how she deals with technology to help people learn more. Our starting point today, in a little story from each of us. So as I'm already talking, I just continue. I learned this this week when I was on the countryside in South Germany that some people are preparing for harder times, as my brother does. He has a big garden, and he has ducks, and they had little ducklings now. And these ducks are special ducks who eat the snails that would eat all the vegetable. Yeah, the vegetable. So, and this was quite exciting for me to learn, and they were so cute, I can tell you. And this was all offline, terribly offline. So it doesn't really add up to the discussion we will have today. But certainly, Sabrina, she learned this week.
Yes, hello from my side as well. So what did I learn last week? I kind of like two things, like it's the 80-20 rule, right? To do it better done than perfect. And also to, because obviously our jobs are very much brain heavy, to just do something with my hands when I'm out of the job and in my free time. So I tried to cement something that I brought from home, so it actually stands straight like a small tree. And I learned that with cement, the 80-20 rule doesn't work quite well, because then if you add too much water, then it creates too many bubbles and the thing breaks. So for anyone who wants to do some handicraft hobbies over the whatever, that's not a good idea.
So he should not ask you, I understand. So Dominic, what's your story this week?
Okay, so I was thinking about what I could say, and I got told off by my mother earlier on this week because I was telling her I was doing a talk which involved some of the parliamentarians from the UK. And I told her there was going to be a Lord Viscount Younger of Lecky. I'm sure he's not listening, so I'm allowed to say that. She told me, don't you dare say Viscount because it's Viscount. So that's what I learned this week. Luckily, I didn't actually have to speak to him, just listen to him.
So, and now we come to you, Jehane. You are a special guest, and we want to learn more from you than ever before. So, and there are these ominous learning blocks, and what are you actually doing?
But you're also allowed to tell an anecdote as well.
Yeah. Okay. No. Yeah. What's your anecdote?
That easily.
So what I learned this past week, and actually maybe the past couple of weeks, is that there are actually birds in New York that chirp. So that's something that I had never realized, how prevalent nature is, and that we actually do have natural ecosystems in the city. But because of lockdown and because of people and cars just not being on the streets, you can actually see nature, being reborn again and waking up. So I think that's been nice to wake up to the sounds of birds and not people honking. So that's something new that I learned this week.
That's so beautiful. No, really, really. Okay, now, what are these learning blocks you have started?
So I can tell you actually a bit about how I started learning blocks, and you can know more about what it is. But basically, prior to starting learning blocks, I was building different education programs for refugees in Lebanon and in Jordan. And a lot of the programs that I was working on were around either digital skills, design thinking, or social entrepreneurship. And in both in Lebanon and in Jordan, everything that we were doing was considered non-formal education that was provided either by NGOs or alternative education providers. And when I was administering those programs, a lot of the students who were taking them would come up to me and ask me for certificates. And given that we were not a recognized education institution that, you know, if we gave them a certificate, people would know who we were, I started thinking about how to best showcase the skills that we were providing the students in a way that would allow them to take the education that we've given them and transition to future education opportunities or even future employment opportunities. So, I realized that this was a major problem that a lot of refugees were facing, especially when I was in Jordan. I was working in the two biggest camps in Jordan for refugees, which were Zaatari camp and Ezra camp. And over there, you really see the impact and the size of the problem, because on any given day, dozens and dozens of NGOs that are providing different workshops, that are teaching so many relevant skills to what is needed right now, but no one was beyond the piece of paper on how to really prove that education. And so I realized the size of the problem. And then when I came back to New York, I was really getting into the blockchain space here. And it sort of clicked in my head that, you know, blockchain could be leveraged as a tool in order to create a better certification system that can issue permanent certificates that even if you don't know the organization that is teaching, and even
wait. Dominic, certifying skills is one of your favorite topics, no? But maybe you can tell us before Jehane goes further, what is really the difficulty here? Why is that important?
Gosh, I feel very important now. I've been given that task.
Yeah, you're the professor in the round. That's why.
I think it really starts from exactly this point of thinking beyond the pieces of paper. I thought that was a great quote. Certification is really this. If we think of it in an educational space, it's giving a recognition that somebody has actually taken part normally in a particular course and acquired the skills which were described in that course. And then at the end of that, maybe they've done some kind of exam, or they've proved in some way that they have acquired these skills, and then it's documented. Normally speaking, when we're thinking of the formal education system, it's documented in such a way that we know, for example, what level of education it was. We also know something about the institution which issued that certificate. And very often they are a public university or a public school. So we know at least intuitively something about those. And this is kind of when we get to the issue that we have at Kiron as well, which is what happens if the issuer isn't a recognizable organization. So it's not kind of not able to describe it or regulate it in the normal way. So it's doing something kind of unusual, which is often what we're trying to do in these spaces where we're trying to really solve some of these social problems. And so then you've got the problem that the issuer is. And then you've got this other problem, which is because it's non-formal education, non-formal is often a bit more kind of holistic, or let's say it's about very specific tasks or very specific content. And so sometimes it's difficult to actually align it to a level. So these are the kind of issues you get to when you start issuing non-formal certificates. So it's to Kiron as well.
My grandfather, you're really a professor. My grandfather always told me, Tino, you're talking like a book. And it wasn't a compliment. Okay, but this is the one side. So people are trying to get ahead, and they learn something, and they want this somehow recognizable afterwards. And then there's the other thing that Jehane said, and there we are at Sabrina's expertise. She said also something about social entrepreneurs. So I understand this as an activity that helps you to get forward. by making connections and building things, no? Or Sabrina, what is this exactly?
Like social entrepreneurship in itself. I would
well, in this context here, yeah.
Certificates. I mean, like, of course, like we have a good example in the room, right, of how that can look like in real life. But when it comes to certification in the non-formal education sector, I would throw in a different experience, actually, because as you may know, like I was with the Red Cross before, and all the work you do there, especially with the young volunteer, if it's trainings in like emergency response or, you know, in first aid or whatever. I mean, those are all super relevant skills that, especially Corona right now, are needed more than ever. But certification there is another thing as well, right? Like, how do you actually portray, and like, as we're all Germans here, in the Red Cross at least, people really love their standards, right? So you can even have fights between different branches. And I hope they're not listening now, but about, you know, like what kind of plasters you can use and what kind of plaster you're not allowed to use. In the end, like it just matters that you can a wound from bleeding, right? And I feel that's a bit the parallels that we have in those discussions as well, because what really counts sometimes it's not as much like how people learned it, right? Or how long they took to learn it, or by whom they were trained. It really matters if they can do it afterwards, right? So like your approach is super interesting because it seems like a way to get a bit closer to that.
Yeah, exactly. We should go on to the example in a second, or to what you're doing. But I just want to say what happens very often is as soon as you start thinking of, you know, an unusual set, okay, we're supporting refugees, it's about non-formal education, you start asking critical questions of the whole kind of learning process, not to ask when it's about formal education. So the things we're going to be talking about now equally apply very often to the formal education system. It's what I wanted to say is often we kind of just accept those because we say, okay, we know roughly there is a university called Bath University or something, so we just accept that everything's fine. And that's one of the biggest challenges, is because you're in the non-formal sector, you don't have this kind of first level of acceptance. And then all these challenges that the normal certificate would also have come into this non-formal space. And so that's why I think this of connecting, thinking about non-formal education to just thinking about how we need to reform education in general is really important, because we just see
well,
it more clearly.
Let's start right now.
No, exactly. I definitely agree with that. And I think that in a way, starting innovating and testing in the non-formal space is sort of like a low-hanging fruit, where because it's non-formal, regulated in different ways, you can really experiment with how to create a better and more equitable education system in a way that in the traditional education sector, it's really hard to change things, because more so than other industries and other sectors, education itself is very rigid and it has a lot of barriers to entry, and certification is actually one of those barriers to entry. And actually not necessarily certification, but more accreditation, because at least in the US, I think in Europe it's a bit different, but in the US, in order to be an accredited university, you actually have to spend around $1 million every 3 to 5 years just to maintain your accreditation status. You need around 5,000 hours of admin work. And all of these, you know, if you're a small education provider, you're not going to spend $1 million just to say that you are official, when you can spend that $1 million on improving your education content, on really, you know, teaching students. So because of that, I think that accreditation in a way is one basically barriers for new entrants in the education space to actually become formal. And so what the way that I view certification is that it's essentially a proof of learning to show the skills that you've acquired through education, and to show it in a way that is trustworthy, so that the next person looking at it, whether it's another educator or an employer, can trust that you've learned those skills through that education program, and then can evaluate you and see whether you're suitable for the next education program or the next education and so that is essentially the credentialing system that we're building. So we are in our certificates, we basically create through blockchain technology, but even like I see blockchain as just a tool. It's not necessarily, you know, the heart of it. It's a tool that allows us to create time-stamped records that are where the identity of who is issuing the certificate, which is the education provider, and the student are verified at the time of issuance. And everything that is put on the certificate is actually put by the education provider, so they can vouch that this was their student and that they've done, you know, that course. And then what we add to the certificates are actually attachments of, and it's also up to the education provider to decide what attachment they want to add, but generally it's course syllabus as well as final projects or any sort of learning outcome that the student has done in that course. And in doing that, the certificate becomes personalized, meaning that if you and I took the same course, we might have had very different results. So our certificates reflect the education and the skills that we've personally and individually achieved. And I personally think that's a better indicator rather than the traditional formal education certificate, which really doesn't have any indication on, you know, what you've actually done in the course. So for example, my undergraduate degree is all in Latin. Like, I don't even understand it. So I can't really take it to, you know, someone and vouch for my education. What it does is it's more institution centered. It says I graduated from this university, and the recognition of that university is basically what people judge me on, rather than what I learned, what I did, you know, what are the experiences that I've had throughout education.
But I don't understand, what has blockchain to do with all of that? I don't understand how it works.
So blockchain essentially is a new technology that was created 11 years ago. So it's still relatively very new, and there's a lot of improvement that is happening and that will keep on happening in the blockchain space. But essentially what it is a better database. And the reason why it's a better database is because it's a distributed database, meaning that instead of putting everything on one computer or in a central system, everything that you record on the blockchain is actually stored on a network of computers that they put on the blockchain on a single computer that creates a network that are the blockchain. Each record that you put on the blockchain, because of how it's verified and how it's created, is essentially something that you cannot change. So once you put something on the blockchain, and it's usually a transaction that happens, and in the case of education, the transaction is between the education provider and issuing the certificate for the student. When you put that on the blockchain, you're time stamping it and you're putting it on there so that no one can remove it and no one can change it. And so in the case of learning, the reason why this is a great technology for record keeping is that even, let's say, if the organization that provided education no longer exists, that record exists forever. So you don't need to go back and find the professor or find the institution to say, I taught that student. The record itself has all the proof that you need, regardless of whether the organization exists. At the same time, it's sent to the student, so the student owns their education record and can share it with whoever they want. And right now, even though you technically own your degree, you have it, if you were to apply to graduate school, let's say, you do have to go back to and get your transcript, get more copies of your degree. So technically, your university still controls your diploma and still controls your transcript. And this is something, it should be in the hands of the student to really share their education with whoever they want and build upon it. And so the third thing that blockchain allows you to do is that once the student has an identity on the blockchain, which is basically what the certificates are sent to, the student can receive certificates from different education providers. So all of their certificates can be stored in one place or under one, what is in blockchain called public address. So you can essentially mix and match different education records and have them all sent to the same place in the blockchain so that you have a portfolio of various degrees that you control. So that's what blockchain enables you to do. It's literally just a tool, you know, and I think there's a lot of hype about blockchain and what it can do, and it can't do everything, you know. What it can do is basically in record keeping, traceability, and tracking. And I think that's really what it's best for.
Yeah, so it's good for the record keeping. And the interesting point is, I was thinking before, maybe for sometimes not to talk about certificates, but just documents. Because in a way, what we're thinking about always when we're thinking of certificates is documenting learning. And this is why you say as well, so we have kind of criteria in there of what you did to receive this document from a particular issuer. And then this document, as you say, I think that's when it becomes really interesting, can have evidence, particularly of assignments and things that you've actually done to prove that you've got these skills or competencies. And then the interesting question is always, okay, if I've got this document, where should I put it, or where should it be put so that the learner can have full ownership of this document? And I think this question of whether blockchain can play the role there. And I think, as you said, that can create a kind of a backbone, or maybe it's better to say it creates a wallet where the learner can start collecting things from different people.
Yeah, exactly.
And then so one of the issues we've always thought about with certificates at Kiron is, if you actually start generating certificates, at what point would it make sense for the learners to just photocopy those and change the names on them?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and you can always say, well, I mean, how often is that going to happen? But
well, it happens a lot, especially with accredited, and especially with, for example, Ivy League schools in the US. A lot of people, you know, say they went to Harvard and they didn't go to Harvard, but they just use the name. And so degree fraud elimination is actually something that the blockchain, or a value that blockchain records provide, because you know who went to your school and you issue them certificates, and then you can verify that transaction on the blockchain in order to make sure that the certificate was issued to that particular student.
I think it's always interesting to think of this exactly in this context of trust as well. So we have to think of what is the use case. Really, we're always thinking of how can we make sure the learner has value from what we're giving to them. And of course, most students will say, okay, I always get a clear value if I've got a degree certificate, because I know that gets me through the first door often for interviews and things like that. Can we create something like that has this kind of value when it's about non-formal education or non-formal learning? And maybe this helps. I think this is part of your argument, that if you can at least prove, okay, we have verified the identity on the one side, and we verified also the issuer on the other. So we know this transaction, which is documented there, actually happened, and we know when it happened as well. That's kind of the strength, I think, of this solution. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I would say that verification is a very big part of it. The other two, I would say, are immutability and permanence. So the fact that you can't change the record. So one, identity of both is verified. The second is change the record. So let's say if I took like an intro to coding class, and then I was an average coder, but then I worked a lot on myself, you know, the best. And so I can't go back and change what I did in my intro to coding course, but I can show the progress, which is also, you know, a value. And third is permanence. So the fact that it will exist forever, and it's very hard to remove and practically impossible to remove things from the blockchain.
But Jehane, let's shift a little bit. I also read that you had to do something with education policy. So what is that part of your life?
So it was actually a program that I was a part of. I think it was end of 2018 till pretty much summer 2019, and it was about basically this policy center asked different people who have worked around refugee integration and refugee education or employment in the Middle East to go through a policy cycle and write policy briefs around our work. And so what I had written on, which I actually also shared at UNESCO in 2018, is how to lay down foundations for 21st century education and to help non-formal actors, especially NGOs, be able to administer that education. So part of my work, and which also led me to learning blocks, is realizing that in the case of Syrian refugees in the Middle East, a lot of the effective education provided through NGOs, whether they were international NGOs or even, you know, newer, let's say like tech and based NGOs. But the problem for them was that a lot of funding that was given to for education usually went through the national official system, where, for example, in Lebanon, the national education system is very problematic and has a lot of issues to begin with, and was at capacity because of Syrian refugees, that even has more Syrian refugees than Lebanese people using it. And there were so many issues there that students were actually not continuing their education, but still all the money was going towards the formal sector. And so part of my policy argument was to show that in order to provide the kind of education and to learn the skills that are needed to be part of, you know, the 21st century economy, NGOs are doing a better job to providing that. And so it was about how to kind of decentralize funding in a way and give it to NGOs rather than going through the problematic national systems.
But that is super interesting because I didn't know that actually about you. But I think it was even the very first Kiron Talk session we had where we were challenged by another speaker actually exactly on that non-formal education and 21st century skills. And I think we picked the skill of problem solving, right? Yeah. And then he was also like, isn't it just a hype? And aren't 21st century skills just something now people make up, you know, to kind of also legitimize non-formal education? Like, what would you tell him in response to that?
Well, I actually think that 21st century skills are definitely not a hype, but I think that the formal system and education system is not made to teach 21st. And I actually had a first-hand experience with that. So in the first education program that I set up, which came out of all 21st century foundations for education, we used design thinking as a way to target some of the 21st century soft skills, which are problem solving, critical thinking, presentation, teamwork, collaboration. And the program that we did actually had 3 pillars. One was digital skills, which are more, you know, like hard 21st century skills. The second was design thinking, and the third was art therapy and social and emotional learning through the art, and which is really important in the case of refugees, because if you don't target mental health, you can't really do education. And but in the design thinking portion, that was actually the most challenging one. And it wasn't challenging because the students were refugees. It was actually challenging because of the educational systems in the Middle East that were all about, you know, memorization based, regurgitating information. There wasn't a lot of room for thinking about problems and thinking out of the box. And we had to, so we had like a curriculum, I would say, or a schedule of how to do the design thinking process. And we were changing it every day because each section, you know, like let's say problem definition took so long, and it was very hard to convey, you know, how to think about a problem beyond just the problems. For example, thinking about girls' education and saying, you know, the problem is not just that girls don't go to school. There are underlying issues that prevent girls from going to school. And so that was very challenging. And I realized how unequipped people are when they're coming from traditional education systems to really figure out how to learn. And I think that the biggest 21st century skill is learning how to learn and unlearn and how to adapt. And you know, those are some things that traditionally education stops at a point, whereas now it never really stops because of how fast the economy is changing, how fast traditional jobs are changing, irrelevant. So I think people don't, like we're still starting the pathway of changing education and of really changing how we think of education. So someone who thinks in a very traditional way of, you learn this, you do an exam, then it's done, you don't touch that subject again, they're going to think that 21st century skills are not that needed. But then if you think of education as something that's beyond the classroom and that's always happening, you realize that the best way is through those soft skills and through nurturing those soft skills.
You're talking about the 21st century, man. You're recognizing that we're just at the beginning, no? So
Yeah.
to challenge your philosophical skills, so what do you expect the skills in this very young century are going to be?
I can give you a straight answer for that, because I think
want a straight answer right now.
Yeah, because I think that it's always going to keep on changing. You know, so I think coding is like what everyone needs to learn, but I think that there's going to come a point where machines are going to code, so we don't even need to learn how to code. I mean, it's obviously a great skill, but I don't think everyone should learn how to do it. I really think it's critical thinking, problem solving, and adapting. I think that whether it's in education or even in life in the 21st century, I think people need to learn how to adapt. And COVID-19 is the greatest example of how, you know, you have to be flexible and nimble and constantly adapting. And I think this is something that is, you know, like the growth mindset or learning how to learn is probably the most important skill.
Totally, because what I sometimes feel is that when we talk about us living in a like Western hemisphere, right, we are really unused to adapt, right? Because at least for me, like we were told, like you plan your studies and you plan your job with what you choose in your studies, right? And you kind of have the feeling there's like a bit roadmap ahead and you just have to follow it somehow and get through it. And in other countries, right, when you're struggling with more insecurities, like either if it's climate or economical insecurities or even political ones, right, then you're much more used to the need to adapt, like although it's, you know, like bad reasons why you have to. But that's something like I've seen during Corona as well, right? Like people are really like in shock when this bubble starts to shake a little bit.
Yeah, that's funny. I mean, being Lebanese, I think that because we've had a lot of political uncertainties and problems in Lebanon, you always learn how to adapt. And it was actually funny. So as you all probably know, you know, New York is one of the epicenters for coronavirus. And I remember having a lot of discussions with my, you know, like for me, it was easier to adapt, I guess. For everyone else, it was like planning evacuation and escape routes out of the city, and you know, buying all the toilet paper and just doing so many things because it's, you know, people are not used to adapting. I would say though that even in countries that do have conflict within education, education is still, like, for example, if we take the case of Lebanon, maybe on a societal level and a personal level, people are used to adapting, but the education system is very rigid. And it is actually a Western education system because a lot of it was inherited from the French system and was adapted to Lebanon. So it's still very like rigid and very all about, you know, going through school, graduating, taking the official exams, then the people, you know, either want to become a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, and it's just very rigid pathways, which I think will change, but and I see that also in India and in other developing countries where, you know, people adapt naturally, but their education is still pretty inflexible.
Yeah, I think actually education systems, you're right. They suggest, firstly, okay, within the education system, there's going to be a stability around you. And then afterwards, we let you into the world and then you can do what you like, kind of thing. So, and this is exactly the thing that when you come with questions, okay, what should we do with, you know, 21st century skills like critical thinking and resilience and things, they say, we can't deal with it within this formal system because we don't know how to teach that. We don't know how to examine that. We don't know what the certificate would look like. And the interesting thing is then when you think of other settings, sometimes you get to more kind of innovative ideas. So I wanted to ask you, you're in farms, not arms, and you were working, I think, in with farmers, I think, in I forget, was it also in the Lebanon maybe? And I think you were helping them learn some skills. So what kind of skills, or what was the program there, and how was that organized?
Yeah, so Farms on Arms is actually still an ongoing project. We the way it started is essentially around how do we help refugees have more food security, and I started building it with an NGO here in New York. It's called Peace Accelerators, and then so it started under the NGO, but evolved into a consortium of different people in agriculture, architects, engineers who came together to design a hybrid agricultural system. And so essentially what the whole process stemmed from design thinking and systems thinking, and started by engaging refugees, understanding how they're eating, how they're planting, how they're working in agriculture, and what are the problems that they're facing. And so we did design sprints in Lebanon for that. Then came to New York and invited different multidisciplinary experts who have built everything from biodynamic farms to urban farms. Like one of our partners in this project is the firm's called Agritecture, and they do a lot of urban agriculture consulting. Then we also had architects, engineers, and we developed this, and everyone who was involved sort of became part of a team that developed this hybrid agricultural system that combines regeneration, which is actually a very ancestral way of doing agriculture that's been forgotten, and that really improves soil health by keeping carbon in the soil. And when you do that, you're actually contributing to climate change. And it's actually one of the least talked about solutions for it, where you actually improve the soil, but then keep the carbon in the soil. And we're mixing this with adapted hydroponics that help you have better, more nutritionally dense vegetables that are grown with less water and less soil. And the whole farm design that we've built out is actually an educational farm that helps participants learn those skills to be able to plant regeneratively and to build hydroponic systems. And so and this is sort of an experiential education provision. And when this project started, there were no talks about education. It was only about a better way for refugees to have food security. And we even realized through our design process that we can't even do that without having the host involved in the whole project, because if you can create food insecurity if you create social conflicts. But regardless of that, like what food really even turned into an education program, because ultimately to be able to adapt and learn different or to be able to even eat in a different way, you need to learn different skills and harness them. So it is like an experiential educational farm. And
so Jehane, you are in New York, but you're still like your main focus is helping refugees in Lebanon. Is it still like this now that there are 1.5 million refugees from or being in Lebanon, in this very small country? What situation are you now reacting to?
Well, that's actually why I think he
comes back. Don't worry.
I'm here.
Okay. Well, I was saying that's actually why I started focusing on refugees in Lebanon. So before I started working with refugees, I was actually working with slum dwellers in India. And throughout my education, especially my master's education, which was very experiential education as well, I realized that I'm really passionate about helping people to opportunities, especially people who are marginalized or considered, living in informal settlements. And so with slum dwellers in India, and it was actually a great experience working in Mumbai for 3 months. But when I was there, it was the peak of the refugee crisis in Lebanon. And that was 2014, 2015. So around that time, I was thinking, what am I doing in India when there's the biggest refugee crisis happening in my own home country? And there's a lot of parallels between slum dwellers and refugees, with refugees being an even more extreme case of marginalization and informalization, because slum dwellers are sort of informal in their own country. They're still citizens, whereas refugees are not citizens. That's an added layer of problems. But because of that, I was focused on focusing on refugees. And then from that was working on, at Parsons and New School, was working on creating systemic solutions for the refugee crisis. And that led me to focus on education to employment. And then from that, working on education bootcamp. So that's sort of been my trajectory. But yeah, I mean, so I'm not just focused on Lebanon, but it is one of my main focuses just because I'm Lebanese and I see Lebanon, especially right now, as facing a lot of problems that in a way it's ahead of the world and a lot of the problems that might happen in other countries. And so I see Lebanon as a great place to test out some of those solutions, and then, that could be adapted to different locations. So for example, with Farms Not Arms, we've interest from a lot of different countries, whether it's in the US, also in Gambia, in Greece, in Turkey, in Tunisia, different places that need similar solutions, and with learning blocks as well. Like, it started within the refugee space, but with the problem is way bigger than refugees. There's, a lot of people are learning in non-formal ways, and they don't even have to be refugees or marginalized. It just makes more sense in even the upskilling market, So like higher education, I think, has been on the decline past 14 years, whereas coding bootcamps, online courses, workshops, have been booming. And so I see, like a lot of the things that I'm working started in Lebanon, but have a lot of different use cases.
Well, we come to the end of our time. It's actually 80 something, and we have to conclude. I was in Lebanon a few years ago, and I saw this incredible stone carved out of the rock near Baalbek, this temple complex the Romans built.
Yeah.
And there's this stone which they not completely carved out of the rock. I think it's the biggest brick in the world, with 5 per 25 meters. Can you imagine this thing? And it wasn't still in a vertical way fixed to the rock, and it wasn't torn out yet. They had a lot of 21st century skills then. Well, that's nonsense. It was a beautiful country, but I didn't really I would like to know more about how is the situation in Lebanon, but we don't have the time. We don't have the time. So, everyone just say something concluding to the moment, and then we gotta get.
Okay, so then I just start. So it was for sure so nice having you, and just with our other guests, like, we could talk for a few hours from here. But I don't know, like, I wish you all the best on your mission to make non-formal education more tangible and more valued. And like, just thinking of all the stuff that I did in youth organizations, like, they're not on my CV anymore. So I would love to see that in the future, right? That not just the formal education is on there, but maybe like a whole matrix of what you acquired in all different internships and youth groups and I don't know what, because I feel there's so much more to what makes you a valuable employee or citizen or whatever. So thanks so much for sharing, and all the best for your work.
Thank you.
I don't really have anything to add to what Sabrina said, because that was basically what I was going to say as well. Especially, Jehane, when we hear everything you've done, I'm sure there's no one document or no one place where it can all be found. And I think we know we have that problem, but many other people have it much worse than us, because